This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Hi everyone, thanks very much Martin and Keith for inviting me today, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. My presentation looks at Mandela's economic legacy as opposed to his political legacy, and I evaluate socioeconomic inequality in South Africa's political economy. I just want to say thank you to the University of Edinburgh Business School, also to the Royal African Society. This presentation grew out of a blog that I did for African Arguments, and to the Institute of Commonwealth Studies for hosting us today. You'll all be familiar with this quote by Mandela, which talks about slavery and apartheid not being natural. It is man-made and can be overcome and eradicated by the actions of human beings. This is the outline for the presentation today. I'm just going to sort of give an overview in the introduction of where we are today in terms of data, statistics, and the actual changes that have happened and how South Africa's economy is doing. And then in the second part of the presentation, which is the analytical framework for the story I'm selling you today, I look at South Africa's political economy in two dimensions. I look at colonialism and apartheid and the minerals energy complex that grew out of that in particular. And then I look at the macroeconomic policy choices that were made under the Mandela and Mbeki governments, which led to financialization of the economy. And then finally, I present some policy recommendations as well as just, some talking points. This is a map of the Gini coefficient globally. The Gini coefficient is a measure of income inequality, with 1 being perfect inequality and 0 being perfect equality. South Africa, some of the statistics say that South Africa has the highest Gini coefficient in the world, making it the most unequal society by income. Denmark, conversely, is the most equal society in the world. This inequality is racialized for obvious reasons due to apartheid. And this economic apartheid shames the ANC as a liberation movement because people have achieved political freedom but not economic freedom. And this is the root of the country's high crime rate, violence, wildcat strikes, protests, and carjackings. The following graph shows the relationship between unemployment and inequality. It's an obvious one because if people don't have income, the Gini coefficient will increase. Levels of inequality have deteriorated under the ANC, but the situation is also structural, and it is rooted in South Africa's economic history. At the same time, though, it is injudicious to say that there have not been advancements in living conditions and infrastructure under the ANC, but the party, in my opinion, has failed dismally at its own election manifesto to create a better life for all. And the new black oligarchy exemplifies that life has certainly gotten much better, but only for some. I think a seismic moment that underscores the present situation in South Africa was the Marikana massacre, which took place in August of 2012 at the Lonmin PLC Marikana Platinum Mine, in which 34 miners were shot and killed by the police in the worst state violence in the democratic era. Marikana traumatized South African society and spooked its foreign investors. So if the ANC does not substantially tackle poverty, the anger of the underclass will thus bring the country to its knees. How did we get here when the ANC had wanted to take on a broadly social democratic model in Ready to Govern and had wanted distributive economic policies to build housing and take people out of poverty? So I argue, as I said, that very poor macroeconomic policy decisions were made under the Mandela and Mbeki governments that favored international finance and hot money over the developmental state. South Africa has since been warned by international ratings agencies to take action on socioeconomic inequality or face further downgrading of its sovereign debt. Moody's said in the notes on the first downgrade that happened in the end of 2012, they explicitly mentioned Marikana and socioeconomic inequality as an issue. But of course, I mean, there's a big contradiction here, and I think that, that there's a lot of competing interests for the ANC to satisfy. Because on the one hand, the ratings agencies want the conditions that are conducive to capital and finance, but these are also at odds with tackling inequality and poverty more aggressively. So there are still concerns, currency volatility, corruption, unemployment, and low economic growth path remain concerns. This is where we're at now at this point in time. And black economic empowerment has been limited in scope and volatile. So what is the likelihood that the ANC could create the economic prosperity that would honor Mandela's political legacy in poverty alleviation, health, and education? So this is just a formal statement of my analytical framework for my approach to the presentation. I'm saying that Mandela's government made a fatal error in prioritizing the financialization of the economy at the behest of international capital over aggressive borrowing for infrastructure. So while social grants have helped to distribute income across the economy, a stagnating economy and rent-seeking between public and private partnerships has socialized losses through low growth and unemployment, and privatized gains through returns on assets and capital flight. Here are just some figures as to the economic deterioration. GDP growth for 2014 is estimated to only be 1.4%, and that's down from 3.6% over 2011. And while it's forecasted to improve, say by 2017, GDP should go up to 2%, 3% of growth. There are still constraints in terms of infrastructure and private investment. So while recent concerns are quite serious, I mean, like in the medium-term budget policy statement, the budget deficit that has grown under Zuma is going to make it quite difficult for the ANC to commit to the infrastructure goals that it has. So the ANC has actually done quite well in terms of pulling people out of poverty in absolute terms. So electrification, I mean, they've not done so well with Eskom, but in terms of providing electricity to households, they maybe have not planned for the extra provision. So by 2000, the number of South Africans with electricity had doubled during the ANC rule. Since 1994, 15 million South Africans have gained access to improved drinking water. Welfare grants have been extended to millions of children, disabled, and the elderly. And the share of South Africans living in formal housing has increased to 75%. I have looked at Africa Check, just to look at some of these figures. In general, this is correct. Obviously, some of them have been massaged, in order to, win the election. So murders are also down, serious assault is down, aggravated robbery is down. In fact, the only crimes that have increased are incidences of drunk driving, drug crimes and commercial crimes, which is evidence actually of improved law enforcement. But now, the rubric of the presentation is about socioeconomic inequality. So we've been talking about poverty and people being lifted out of poverty, but why is it important to talk about inequality? Because there is no such thing as meritocracy when there are not equal starting blocks. Focusing on poverty also takes attention away from the rich by studying the poor as some sort of deserving other. We also need to differentiate between income inequality and ideas of economic inequality and ideas such as social justice. The work of Amartya Sen is quite good for this. And there exist different metrics of utility, incentives, and inequalities, therefore, as Marikana showed, become everyone's problem, because if social cohesion unravels, then there is no environment for which business to practice. And this year's blockbuster was Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, which deals with income inequality. Inequality has been a trending topic in general, globally, because there have been serious concerns in terms socially. And basically, the book can be summarized as the return on assets being larger than economic growth, and that's towards privately held assets. We'll see that that's actually quite an important equation for the situation that South Africa is in at the moment, because there are large amounts of portfolio capital inflows which are greater than foreign direct investment, and that's kind of the root of the problem. I'm not going to spend too much time on the history of apartheid and the minerals energy complex. I'm sure it's being dealt with today, and there are better scholars than me on this point. But anyway, so the key kind of bullet points are 1652, when the Dutch arrived, 1820 with British settlers, and 1948, which was the official beginning of apartheid. In sum, the history of inequality, says Stephen Gelb, is rooted in the racialization of factors of production, namely labor, land, and capital, and this has been aggravated by the minerals energy complex through the conglomeration of parastatals. Now, this is important as well in terms of how it links back to the policy decisions that were made and the problem with financialization, because, as Alan Hirsch says, that the miners simply bought up most of the rest of the economy when gold prospects started to dim, with the result in the 1980s when companies from the United States, Europe, and the United Kingdom disinvested their South Africa holdings. The only available buyers were the already huge South African financial mining house conglomerates. So the turning point. There will have been some, I heard there's been a lively discussion today about whether Mandela was a communist or not. But the interesting thing is that in the turn to transition, this quote summarizes the message that Mandela was telling foreign investors before the ANC took power. Now, this is at odds with the RDP and the social democratic model and some of the other things that they wanted to do. But anyway, so Mandela said, "Let me assure you that the ANC is not an enemy of private enterprise. We are aware that the investor will not invest unless he or she is assured of the security of their investment. The rates of economic growth we seek cannot be achieved without important inflows of foreign capital. We are determined to create the necessary climate which the foreign investor will find attractive." This quote is significant because one of the main issues that foreign investors feared at the transition was the possible expropriation without compensation of assets by the state through nationalization, which is widely believed to be rooted in this paragraph of the Freedom Charter, which was written in 1955. It says, "The mineral wealth beneath the soil, the banks, and monopoly industry shall be transferred to the people as a whole." But the author of the ANC Freedom Charter, the MP Ben Turok, has disputed this interpretation, which has been adopted by Julius Malema and the EFF, for example, saying that it was never intended as a call for nationalization or expropriation without compensation. It showed rather a broader understanding of benefiting the people as a whole, and Turok said that in 2012. But the crucial question remains, what was Mandela's position on nationalization by the turn of democracy in 1994? The veteran journalist Alistair Sparks said that following his release, he had written an article on Zambia's failed nationalization program, and Mandela invited him to discuss the nationalization issue. And after about a very long discussion, Mandela said he didn't actually know enough about economics, so he would have to call in some business people. But the great U-turn, says Sparks, in Mandela's attitude towards nationalization came through a series of visits to the World Economic Forum in Davos. And when Mandela attended the 1992 forum, what everybody told him was that if nationalization happened in South Africa, they would get no investment from foreigners. So the background of the Freedom Charter and the distributive agenda of the ANC versus the demands of international capital is crucial to understanding the political economy of the transition to democracy. The negotiated nature of the transition meant that capital reform in South Africa would necessarily be an incremental, market-focused process allocating rents to the black middle class. Now, the economic historian Sampieter Blanche, who's written a history of inequality in South Africa, argues that Mandela and the other negotiators in the ANC made a series of deals that strengthened the big white-owned minerals companies and the minerals energy complex, which dominated South Africa's economy, therefore robbing the nascent apartheid state of the resources it would need to tackle poverty. He calls this the elite compromise or the elite conspiracy reached between the ANC and business. And he says it exonerated white corporations and citizens from the part they played in the exploitation and deprivation of blacks. It also enabled whites to transfer almost all their accumulated wealth intact to the new South Africa. Even some of Mandela's colleagues in the ANC believed that they didn't bargain hard enough at that point in the transition. Ronnie Kasrils, who was intelligence minister from 2004 to 2008, says that there was actually a missed opportunity because the balance of power was in the ANC's favor. And there was an opportunity for radical change at the negotiating table that was ultimately accepted. It is by no means certain that the old order, apart from isolated rightist extremists, had the will or capability to resort to the bloody repression envisioned by Mandela's leadership. And Kasrils believes that if they'd held their nerve, they could have pressed forward without making some of the concessions. So the Reconstruction and Development Program that was ushered in with the ANC's power in 1994 was quite rapidly replaced by GEAR, which is the Growth, Employment and Redistribution Program. And GEAR embraced inflation targeting, guaranteeing positive real interest rates, budget deficit discipline, and capital controls. And these are all kind of fiscal measures that make rapid financialization and portfolio inflows easier. Now, how has this actually manifested in reality, these decisions changing from RDP to GEAR? South Africa's actually got a very, very extreme level of financialization. As a percentage of the economy, 15.3% of the economy was in the financial services sector in 1994. By 2009, this had grown to 21.4% of the economy. As an example, the UK is 25% of the UK economy is in the financial sector. And we saw the financial crisis, how those losses became socialized with the bailing out of the banks. This is not a great situation to be in. There's a recent book by John Christensen and Nicholas Shaxson called The Finance Curse. And similarly, countries that are resource heavy, that have a resource curse, I mean, there's, it's not really wise to have the economy so diversified, just as, a general rule of thumb. But the thing is that financialization and market liberalization is neither necessary or sufficient for long-term economic growth, because it converts savings into financial assets which may not be productive investments and also result in employment cuts. And here in the graph beneath, you can see the pace of financial market liberalization in South Africa relative to other BRICS countries. I mean, that's pretty extreme in relation to some of the others. The graphs that follow now show that stock market capitalization in South Africa, also relative to other emerging countries, means that South Africa, relative to GDP, actually is one of the largest stock markets in the world. And actually, all of these capital inflows have been responsible for the current account deficit as an external balance of goods and services, a percentage of the current account. So the other problem as well is that these global portfolio capital inflows means that it's also the only BRICS country where portfolio inflows are larger than foreign direct investment inflows. Portfolio inflows are highly volatile, they're pro-cyclical, they can negatively impact credit and liquidity. It's contributed to a strong rand, which increases the cost of labor and inputs for foreign investors, and basically makes the cost of business quite unpredictable. And relative to GDP, so there's also been, what also happens when an economy becomes financialized and based in a stock market, it means those assets are turning over quite quickly as people invest and disinvest in those portfolios. And this not only diverts resources away from productive investments, it also increases the possibility of illicit financial flows to tax havens by capital flight. And, just as a final point, the financial crisis has also shown the fallacy of orthodoxy in financial economics. GEAR has ultimately thus resulted in financial sector deepening, which in my opinion also resulted in what David Harvey refers to as the financialization of accumulation, which is also accumulation by dispossession. And this has informed some of the recent civil society movements we see, such as the Landis People's Movement, Abahlali Basemanjindolo, and I think there's quite interesting thinking happening in this regard. So, some talking points, where do we go to from here? I just want to say I'm not agnostic about blind faith in GDP and markets, and I think this is part of the problems in terms of how we measure progress, how we measure economic prosperity. The National Development Plan at the moment is a document and a program which is going to put South Africa on a better growth path and take people out of poverty, and what Manuel refers to as the virtual cycle of growth and investment and development. But the National Development Plan, if you look more closely, also promotes financialization agenda through price stability and fiscal restraint. And I think it really needs to move to a developmental state agenda. We also need to question this race to the bottom of industrialization and financialization, which casualizes labor, and concentrate on infrastructure programs, manufacturing, education, and job creation. Some capital controls are necessary within reason. On the one hand, you want to signal that a company is open for trade and investment. On the other hand, you can't have your economy vulnerable to currency speculators and hot money. South Africa, for example, due to the high interest rates that we use in the inflation targeting strategy, is one of the chief currencies in the global carry trade. So people will borrow money in Japan at 0% and invest it in South Africa, and those portfolio inflows are very destabilizing for the economy. And I agree with Piketty that we need a wealth tax, especially on portfolio returns and corporate taxes, distributive measures. BE needs to be amended to be more distributive, and we need to concentrate on economic justice and inequality, not just income inequality. And we need to tackle corruption, which Paul will talk about quite a bit in his presentation. I mean, the value of the arms deal was over 60 billion rand. And, you know, it's tragic to think how that money could have been better spent. Thank you very much.